I'm reading The Great Turkey Walk by Kathleen Karr. I'm going to read chapters 3 and 4. It was a perfect June day. Fields of corn was green and growing to the right and left of the road west. My turkeys sure looked fine plowing down the center of that road, their feathers gleaming in the sun. My, but they went at a clip once they got the feel of freedom beneath their feet. That first day we must have made 25 miles. Mr. Peace, he kept the mules going to the front of us, and the turkeys followed like he was the Pied Piper himself. Emmett, he thought he'd died and gone to heaven. He was that happy, having tails to nip at, a flock to keep organized. And even better than all that, when we fixed to camp, he didn't need to dig into our supply of corn. Those birds just mowed down the surrounding grass before tucking up for the night. I started a cook fire, then lounged next to it while Mr. Peace flung some bacon slabs in the pan. What kind of a dog is Emmett, Mr. Peace? I finally wondered aloud. Well, now, he's a terrier. Terriers usually love to hunt. After today, though, seems to me he's got in him a little sheepdog somewhere. More than a little. I smoothed the short hair of the dog, splayed out on my lap. I think Emmett's found his true calling. Come first light, I didn't have to do a thing with those turkeys. They was already gliding down the trees they'd taken roost in, scrabbling about, some of them even heading off to the west. Never saw birds so keen to travel. Of course, then Mr. Peace and I, we had to swallow our coffee and breakfast bacon right fast. Emmett was having a time keeping the birds from getting to Denver before we did. Things went along fairly fine all morning. We walked through the hamlet of Adamsburg, pretty much hogging the road. People saw us coming. They shook their heads in amazement. Carts and wagons, they tended more to see those huge, striving turkeys as hordes of locusts. They pulled to the side of the dirt road and gave us plenty of leeway. It wasn't until we hit the town of Mount Sterling that we came up against something I hadn't given much thought to. Of course, there were a lot of things in this life I hadn't given much thought to. Rivers was high up on that list. I'd set my eyes on the Missouri River a few times. That was on account of the fact that it wasn't but a few miles to the north of Uncle Lucas's farm and Union, the town my school was in, where I'd found Bidwell Peace. I had talked some with Miss Rogers over the general plan of the trip, though. We decided to steer clear of the big river and stay with the road for far as it went. This was mostly because the railroad ran along the river. Now, I had a certain amount of faith in my birds, but I knew for a fact they wouldn't take to no railroad. My flock hadn't been too flighty yet, but set them next to a steaming, bellowing locomotive, and Hades only knew what mischief they'd get up to. Well, there wasn't any railroad in Mount Sterling. There was, however, the Gasconade River. Just like that, moving due north and to meet up with the Missouri, blocking our way west. Mr. Peace pulled the wagon to a halt just above the ferry landing. The ferry boat was loading up to go across. Mr. Peace looked back at me and the birds. How are we going to get them turkeys on that little ferry boat, Simon? Take about 30 trips to pass them across. He pulled off his slouch hat to wipe at his forehead. Then there's the toll to consider. Toll on 1,000 birds almost wipe us out complete. I took in the sight with some trepidation. It weren't a huge river, like to the Missouri, but that Gasconade was sure and certain too deep and fast to wade across. Meanwhile, my birds were flocking up around me, excited like, crowding near the banks of the water, gobbling and clicking their silly heads off. Emmett was standing stock still, not sure what was required of him. Behind us all, a few dozen of the townsfolk were staring to take in interest of our situation. Whew! Where the darn fools think there's a-going? Going to drown them birds and put 'em out of their misery. Why ain't we save 'em the trouble? I could fancy me a turkey supper tonight. How about you, George? Now that you mention it, Elmer, I could too. Easy. I considered the men closing in on us. Then I twisted around to study the river again. I wasn't brought up too quick thought, but quick thought was needed at that moment. What happened to birds that was riled up good and proper? I knew the answer to that one. But could my turkeys be counted on to perform what came natural to them? I bent down to Emmett. His pointy little ears were already cocked, waiting for orders. Go get 'em, boy. Chase those turkeys straight into the river. Emmett gave me an odd look for an instant, but I stood firm. Then I rounded to one side of the flock and let out a god-awful rumpus. Emmett took off to the other side, and the way we'd been doing for a day and a half. This time, though, he set in to barking up a storm. Together we drove our birds to the very brink of the Gasconade River. Then we drove them into it. Except they didn't go into the river. Instead, they spread their wings and flew straight and clear, all the way across that water. I held my breath, amazed at the wonder of it. Those bronze feathers surely did look a beautiful sight, swooping so graceful through the sky. When the turkeys came to the other side, I was still holding my breath. Would they just keep on flying, away from me forever? I could see Miss Rogers' lifetime savings floating off to the great beyond, to some turkey Zion in the sky. My breath returned when they set themselves down again, nice as you please, and there they stood. That entire flock was waiting for me on the other side of the river. They even raised their heads after they'd settled their wings again, raised their heads and peered back across like to say, "What are you waiting on, Simon? We're here." I swung toward Bidwell Peace. He'd gone pale as a ghost under his sunburn. Slowly, he clapped the hat back atop his sparse hair and jostled the reins still gripped in one hand. Sparky and Snowball led the mule train down the riverbank and onto the waiting ferry boat. Emmett and me followed. As the boat was casting off, I looked back at the townsfolk. They were in a clump, sort of shambling from one foot to the other, still too disbelieving to say aught. "A turkey supper will cost you $5 a bird," I shouted back at them. "But you'll have to come to Denver to get it." Those birds must have been more tuckered out from their exertions than they looked. We hadn't made more than a mile or two after the river when we passed through a nice stand of hickory and black walnut. Without a by your leave, my turkeys took to the trees, roosting for the night. All it needed was for one of them to have the idea. Pretty soon the entire 1,000 birds was settled in, reddish-purple heads poked under their wings. It happened so fast, I had to yell Mr. Peace and the wagon back. He swiveled his neck from the mules, then his eyes went wide. "Where's the dickens them birds?" I pointed up to the trees. His bony Adam's apple stretched up with his neck as he verified what he couldn't believe. "But it's hardly 3 in the afternoon." "You want to get him back down?" "No." He slumped down from the wagon seat. "But I would like a drink. Don't think all this drama is good for my heart." I handed him the water jug. He shoved it aside. "Weren't the sort of drink I had me in mind of." I took a swig. "Only kind of drink you'll be seeing till Denver, if that 10% still interests you." Mr. Peace stared longingly down the road we'd just traveled. "It's only a couple miles back to town. I'd be here in camp before nightfall." I drank again. By nightfall, I'd have me another drover. He nodded. "The way you do things, you probably would, at that." He pulled himself together and brightened some. "Seeing as how we're stuck here for the duration, I might as well take the opportunity to whip up one of my culinary delights." I spit out a mouthful of water. "What in thunder's a culinary delight?" "Gather some kindling, Simon. Lots of kindling. You're about to learn some new tricks." By sundown, the smell of Mr. Peace's culinary delight must have been wafting through 3 counties, least enough so that we'd picked up a stray to join us for supper. In point of fact, I hadn't helped much in creating that supper, aside from gathering firewood. After I'd got a good pile growing near the wagon, I took off back to the woods to where the stream had been following wandered. Then I pulled off my boots and woolen socks and sank my toes in the water. It felt just fine after all the miles I'd put beneath these feet that last 2 days. More miles than I'd ever gone in my entire life, seemed like. Next thing you know, I was sleeping like a baby. At least I must have drifted off, because when I come to again, darkness had started settling down through the leaves over my head. I propped myself up on one elbow and yawned. Then I jumped. "Who's there?" Seemed like a face was staring at me from across the stream. Dark face. "Nobody." I sat up. "Nobody can't talk, can he? I mean, it stands to reason if nobody is truly not there, then..." The face came closer, followed by a body that splashed through the stream. "I gives up. I gives myself up to you, master. You look harmless enough. Just feed me. I'm that hungry." "Whoa now," I straightened my back. "I ain't nobody's master, and never mean to be. Even Uncle Lucas never kept no slaves." I stopped to consider. Then again, maybe he figured he'd had enough between me and Aunt Mabel and the cousins. "Don't know what you's goings-ons about, but I'm hungry, master. That smell came through clear to the other side of the woods, and my nose done led me to you. I'm giving myself up. You can get the reward. Beyond caring is what I am. Just feed me." I finally remembered about my boots and socks. "Hold on a minute till I get these on." Then I was up, standing next to a boy about my age. My height, too, if he was to stop bowing and scraping long enough to tell. But even with that, you could see he weren't hardly more than skin and bones next to me. Now let's start over again, without this masterful rule. "I'm Simon Green. Who are you, besides hungry and nobody?" He finally grinned. Jabeth Value. From down in... I held up a hand. Don't want to know where you're from, but you hear somebody hollering? That'd be Mr. Peace. I reckon his culinary delight's about ready to eat. And from the size of the pot he was cooking it in, there's bound to be enough for 3. Mr. Peace, he hardly even blinked when he saw me coming out of the woods, followed by that truly scrawny black boy. Company for supper? Good. Got enough for an army here, and I like my bean pie to be appreciated. I moved closer to the bubbling cauldron. Aunt Mabel's old iron pot, sure and certain, hadn't smelled this good when I liberated it from the back shed where she stowed used up things. Bean pie? I sniffed again. Bean and bacon and molasses pie. Mr. Peace expanded. Invented it myself. I turned to the company. Set yourself down, Jabeth, before you collapse. Hope you don't mind eating out of the fry pan, because we only got 2 tin plates to our name. Jabeth Value didn't do no more kowtowing after he'd eaten. He'd stuffed himself too full. He lounged there in the darkness surrounding the fire, groaning blissfully for about 15 minutes while Mr. Peace and I played with our toothpicks. Then he finally spoke. That was a mighty fine crust, Mr. Peace, sir. Flaky on top, juicy underneath. My compliments. Thank ye, Mr. Peace drawled. Took some pains with it. I knowed it. If my mama was alive, even she couldn't top it. I knowed it. That sparked my interest some. You an orphan, Jabeth? Like me? Recent, he said, just recent, which is why I took off. He belched gently and rubbed his distended stomach. Figured I'd make for the Kansas Territory and freedom. Funny thing, Mr. Peace started, but Kansas Territory is where we're headed. I finished. Near as far as it goes. Near as far as the Utah Territory. Jabeth Value's black eyes glinted with the firelight. He grinned for the second time since I'd met him. Chapter 4. Nobody said anything about Jabeth's status come morning, or hardly anything. We just got up with the birds and made ready to move on. In point of fact, it was Jabeth who woke us. Ow! He yelled. Help! Help! I rolled over in my blankets and cranked open an eye. There was Jabeth, just lying stiff as a corpse on the ground with a plump tom turkey hovering over him, pecking at his hair with interest. Shoo! Shoo him away, Jabeth, I muttered. He don't mean no harm. Just never seen hair like yours before. What is it? With a sigh, I propped myself up. Why, it's a turkey. A bronze turkey. I reached for a pebble and lobbed it over. The tom took off. Jabeth sat up and looked around. They's all over. He near to screamed it, freezing up again. Giant turkeys all over, in the trees, on the ground. I'm surrounded. Well, I hope to heaven they're all over, and I hope to heaven they keep their weight. Near to 30 pounds, some of them toms. You're looking at my meat and potatoes, Jabeth, my future. This is my turkeys. Jabeth shivered. That set me to thinking again. Weren't you brought up on a farm? How is it you've never seen a turkey? Pigs, he said. The master raised pigs, and a few laying hens. Pigs I could deal with any day. They don't creep up on a body this-a-ways. I finally got up to roll my blankets. You want to trail along with this here business establishment? You got to learn to love turkeys, Jabeth. He struggled out of the blanket I'd loaned him. I love turkeys, he said. I love them to pieces. But he tiptoed mighty carefully around the fresh batch, pecking by his bare feet. A few hours into our morning exercise, I got to thinking about how Jabeth done steeled himself to run away in the first place. However he could have managed it. That fellow was nothing but a bundle of nervous bones. Take the way he was walking, left flank this very minute. I'd set him to that side so he could watch Emmett at work and get some training from him. But he didn't seem to be picking up the way of it real fast. What he was doing was flapping his arms ever so often like a scarecrow. Of course, with his ragged shirt and pants flapping along with those skinny arms, the overall effect was to upset my birds. I watched him skitter a dozen or so into needless flight. Then I bit the bullet. Jabeth? Yes, sir, Master Simon. Least he'd gotten past the master part. Mr. Simon. Least he'd gotten past the master part. Still and all. Just Simon, Jabeth. Simon, plain and pure. I ain't no older than you. Howsoever I look at it. Yes, sir, Simon. I shut my mouth. He was progressing. And it's not like he'd had all those years Miss Rogers had to learn my name down pat. Come walk with me a piece, Jabeth. We'll try us a new tack with your turkey training. Yes, sir, Simon. He flapped on over. We got us to the other side of the town of Lynn that day, no thanks to Jabeth Value. I watched my turkeys roost themselves in a heavy growth of oak and elm while I pondered over the situation, just standing there, scratching my head. That fellow had no feeling for birds whatsoever. He was willing, right enough, but he sure and certain wasn't able. Didn't look like a gift he was about to be blessed with either. I walked over to the wagon where Mr. Peace was ungearing the mules. "Hey, Simon," he said. "Hey, Mr. Peace." I tickled Sparky between the ribs. Sparky snorted and gave a little braying laugh. Mr. Peace tossed down a neck collar. "Your boy don't seem to have an aptitude for birds, Simon." "That's a fact." I tickled Sparky some more. "I was just worrying over it. You could set him off on his own again. He was managed afore he found us." "Weren't managing. Was starving himself to an early grave, more like." "Ain't your place to feel responsible, son." Mr. Peace slung off another neck collar. "Ain't, but I do. Then again, he's got a mighty big appetite, and we only provisioned for 2. I don't begrudge him the food. Just wish I could put a finger on his talent. Miss Rogers always said as how there's a place for every soul in this world, only needs to be found." Mr. Peace started in, leading Sparky to the stream we'd stopped next to. The turkeys had already availed themselves of it. It might have gone down an inch or 2 from their thirst, but there was still water enough left. "Where's J-Beth now?" I turned back from my considerations of the stream to Mr. Peace. "Borrowed my knife and took himself off into the woods first thing we stopped." "Maybe he's figured the situation out for himself then. Maybe he's already taken off on his own." "He wouldn't have left for good with my only knife, Mr. Peace. That I'm sure of." J-Beth didn't neither. He poked out of them woods again about a half hour later, and he came with peace offerings. "I knowed I didn't do a real fine job for you today, Simon, sir." He handed me a passel of fresh stream trout strung up on some wild grapevine. "But I'll do better tomorrow." I stared at the fish. Behind me, I could hear Mr. Peace trotting over right fast. "Where'd you get them trout, J-Beth?" he asked. "In the little crick pool back in them woods." "How'd you get 'em?" I wondered out loud. "A body can fish that's a ways. He oughtn't be half starved to death the way you are." "Got 'em with your knife, of course." He wiped the blade on an intact square of his trousers and handed it back. "Tied it to a stick and just aimed." He passed the string along to Mr. Peace. "Didn't have no knife when I got off from my master. Never had me one of my own." I studied the knife in my hand, then slowly pulled its sheath from my belt. "Here." I handed them both over. "Why don't you just keep on borrowing it for a while? Forget about the turkeys. You're our new provisioner." "I am?" J-Beth blinked, then made a little dance of pleasure in his bare feet. "I'll just head on back before I lose the light then. Get us a few more for breakfast. We can keep 'em fresh in that water yonder overnight." I turned to Mr. Peace, who was already squatting over the catch, cleaning it. He was whistling as he worked. He stopped to grin up at me. "Nothing like a mess of fresh trout to follow last night's bean pie. I do admire fresh trout." "You reckon he can stay then?" "Long as he contributes, son. Long as he contributes." He set to with more gutting. "Speaking of which, why don't you contribute some of them wild onions grown over the way, Simon? Pan-fried trout is mighty fine stuffed with wild onions." J-Beth sure did take to my bowie knife. He polished it lovingly after supper, then set into whittling at a stick he'd fetched back at our breakfast fish. Stick he'd fetched back with our breakfast fish. I watched him lazily, thinking about the last whittling I'd seen back in Union. The whittling on the porch of the general store that had found me Bidwell Peace. J-Beth was whittling different, though, with more of a will. I watched some more between fighting to keep my eyes from shutting. It suddenly hit me. "You making something, J-Beth?" "What'd you expect?" he fired back. "Never seen nobody make something out of their whittling before." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they just sort of whittles to see them little curls of wood spring up. The longer the curl, the better. And they throws the stick away and starts out fresh with another one." "My mama never taught me to waste time like that. You whittle something useful." I sat up straighter, squinting through the dark. "So what is it you're making then?" "Just a minute now, and I'll show you." J-Beth's long, slim fingers worked that knife like the finest tool. I studied its precision with interest. My bowie knife hadn't ever done that kind of labor before. Finally, the blade stopped flashing in the firelight. I glanced over to Mr. Peace to get his opinion. Too late. He was already beginning to snore atop his bedroll. A strange sound jerked my head back. A kind of haunting sound. Where'd that come from? That sound? J-Beth took the stick from his mouth and it stopped. "From my flute." My jaw dropped open. "You just made a musical instrument in a few minutes? And you can make it play, too?" J-Beth flashed a smile. Get me some solid hunks of wood can make me a fiddle. I can make that sing, too. Son of a gun. I remembered to shut my mouth. I guess Miss Rogers was correct, as usual. Who's Miss Rogers? Only the kindest, loveliest lady in this entire world. Like to meet her sometime. Ain't had too much experience with kind, lovely ladies. My mama aside. J-Beth put that flute into his mouth again. This time the music that came forth sounded just like Miss Rogers. Graceful and twinkling and full of light and life. I lay back onto my own bedroll and shut my eyes. I didn't even bother to explain why Miss Rogers was right, as usual. She just naturally knew how to find the best in any poor soul. I drifted off to sleep, peaceful.